right, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. This morning we're going to look at John chapter 9. And in John chapter 9, Jesus disagrees with the prevailing assumption of the day that this man's blindness, we meet a man who was born blind here in John chapter 9. And Jesus challenges the status quo that says that this man's blindness was a result of his parents' sin. And when we look for these sorts of sayings in the Bible to try and see where they're coming from, we can see sometimes in the Proverbs that we see that evil follows after sin and those sorts of things. And so Proverbs gives us some general principles of life, and some even sound familiar to what these disciples of even Jesus are saying. But the book of Job really shows us that those principles can't be used to explain why bad things happen to good people. There are many ways that the sins of the parents can have negative consequences on their future generations, but that's very different from saying that God will hold children accountable for their parents' sin. Let's zoom back out though and find out where we're at here in the book, in the Gospel of John, in John's gospel message for us, his good news. We're in the sixth of the 7 miracles that happen in the first half of John. We've already seen the water into wine, the healing of the royal official's son. He didn't even go to his house. He said, go, he's going to be healed. He's healed a disabled man. He's fed 5,000. He's walked on the water immediately after that. And now, Jesus is going to do something that even the man says has never been known since the beginning of time. He's going to heal a man who was born blind. We're also in the 7 I am sayings. We haven't really hit the chapter 10 and 11 where most of them occur, but Jesus has already claimed to be the bread of life in chapter 6 when he was handing out bread to everyone. Last week he claimed to be the light of the world, and if we separate out the Jesus claiming to be the I am, last week, which is an allusion to the name Yahweh from the burning bush, right, from Exodus. Last week we saw the Jewish leaders sarcastically ask if Jesus was greater than Abraham. And Jesus replies, before Abraham was, I am. And they picked up stones to stone him because they knew what he was claiming, right? And now Jesus is going to claim, just like last week when I said, I am the light of the world, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now he's going to say again this week that he is the light of the world. And of course, what happens is a man who was walking in darkness because he was blind now sees because of the light of the world, because of Jesus. But first, let's back up even further in the Bible, and let's look at the question that the disciples pose here in verse 2. Let me read verses 1 through 7 of John chapter 9. And as he was passing by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus answered. This came about so that God's works might be displayed in him. I must do the works of him who sent me while it is day. Please stop. It's very distracting, okay? I must do the work of him who sent me while it is still day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After he said these things, he spit on the ground and made some mud from the saliva and spread the mud on his eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he left, he washed, and he came back seeing. The disciples are asking in verse 2, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And frequently, it's pointed back to Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. We went over this in the class. That the transgressions of the fathers will not be unpunished. He doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. And he does that by dealing with the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. And commonly we think of that as meaning he's punishing the third and the fourth generation. Remember how on Wednesday night I said that this was the most quoted verse of the Bible and that I was trying to stay out of the rabbit hole of the last part of the verse? This is that rabbit hole. Now we need to talk about that last part of it. Let me just read the quote from Exodus 34 instead of trying to piece it up. The Lord passed before him. This is when Moses is getting the new tablets. And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in loyal love and faithfulness, keeping loyal love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. But he by no means leaves the guilty unpunished, responding to the transgression of the fathers by dealing with the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Exodus 34:7 points to how God works in the complex reality of human failure and the consequences of that failure. And especially, it speaks of God's desire to have a covenant relationship with humanity. And God's answer is that he's going to bring justice to address the sin of every generation. One of the other stories we can look at is the story of Joseph. Right? How God is able to respond to an entire generation, all of Joseph's brothers, to a generation of evil, and to generations, plural, of evil, by planning good and bringing deliverance through Joseph. So you see, in a way, God is putting a limit on how long he will let humans continue in their iniquity before turning it into something that is good. Not the evil actions, but using those actions for good. And so this is really the opposite of how we think of this verse, and it's the opposite of how the Pharisees were thinking about this verse. The consequence of our sin will affect future generations. But God offers refuge to every generation, and he holds every generation accountable. And so the idea of generational curses, it might resonate with some people's lived experience. Right? If my grandfather and his grandfather and his grandfather were all denied basic human, what we call human rights, and not allowed to prosper, then even when those restrictions are lifted, I might still be predisposed to thinking in that term of being oppressed. But that sort of thinking does not resonate, does not borrow language from the Bible. And it tends to paint God as the one who punishes future generations because of the parent's sin. And that's just not what happens. In Ezekiel chapter 18, God again references, we don't have time this morning to get into it, a common saying among the people that the children suffer the punishment of their parents. And God directly refutes that. This is the most direct refutation in the Bible of this idea. God directly refutes that idea by painting a story of 3 generations. And in that story, God highlights how he evaluates each generation based on their own merits. How he then goes on to say that even the righteous and the wicked can change their own course in their lifetimes. And so that just, it's like a highlighter, highlighting that God's nature is that he wants to be with us in our suffering. And the consequences we face for the sin of others are not God's punishment on us. Rather, it's God consistently willing to offer divine forgiveness and work good through our evil circumstances. Now, as we move into chapter 9, let's look at chapter 9 now. Jesus is going to firmly resist any sort of analysis of how the world is ordered based on what the Pharisees are teaching, right? The world is stranger than that. It's darker than that. And the light of God's word is powerful. And I mean that in the dualistic sense of his word, the Bible, and his word, the Son of God, Jesus. But the light of God is powerful. His loving justice shines more brightly than the evil that's in this world. But to understand it, we have to be prepared to dismantle our own cherished assumptions, right? And we need to let God remake them according to his will. So we have to stop thinking of the world as a sort of moral slot machine, right? Put the coin in, pull the arm, and something random happens, right? Or we put in a coin, a good act, right? Or an evil one, and we get out a particular result, a reward or punishment. That's not the way God set up the world. Of course, our actions have consequences, right? Good things often happen as a result of good actions, right? Kindness, if I offer kindness to somebody, often the result is gratitude. And bad things happen through bad actions, right? Drunkenness causes what? Car accidents, family issues, all sorts of things. But those actions are not inevitable. Kindness is sometimes poo-pooed. Some drunk people get away with driving home. And as we look at this point in particular, you can't stretch it all the way back to a previous life or to someone else's sins. Being born blind doesn't mean that you must have sinned or that your parents have sinned, Jesus says. It means something even weirder, even stranger. And it's something that's even more mysterious and even more hopeful, right? Is that the chaos and the misery of this present world is the raw material that God is using to show his love, to show his wisdom, that he's making this new creation out of. Right? When Jesus heals this man, John clearly intends for us to see the action that's going on there as one of the moments in his message, his gospel here, when God's truth and the words of life, Jesus, in the flesh, and theology and historical, the history of Israel, coming together into one. That the truth and the history of the world are coming in together into one when he says, I am the light of the world. There in the verse 5. And those words sort of bring us back all the way to John chapter 1 when John says that the life was in him, and this was the light of the human race. So John chapter 1, verse 4. And as he goes on to say there in chapter 1, we see part of what it means that the light shines in the darkness, and that the darkness did not overcome it. John's gospel is pushing us forward into the heart and the mind of God's good creation, his new healed creation, like this blind man would be willing to testify to a time when God will make all things new. At the start of the book of Genesis, God is faced with this chaos, right? He doesn't waste any time setting up a panel to study it or discuss it, like we do when we workshop things, right? What does he do? Instead, he creates light. And following the creation of light, he creates a new world. And here, John wants us to understand that Jesus is doing the works of him who sent me. And that this chaos that he's here to confront, the night, the darkness, and the future chaos that's right around the corner here in chapter 12, when Jesus will be killed and the world is plunged back into darkness, literally and figuratively. At this moment in chapter 9, John is establishing a new world of light through Christ. A new world of healing is possible through him. And after the chaos of his death, his burial, and his resurrection, he's going to bring about that new day. That first day that has been made new. He's going to bring that new creation into life, into being on that first day. That's John, what I'm trying to say is John chapter 20 and verse 1. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. She saw the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she went running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said to him, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." That's the good news, that Jesus is a new creation. He's transformed from the death of this world into a new creation. And so nobody in the story here in John chapter 9 could figure out whether this man was the same man or not, right? So sometimes when we hear good news, or sometimes let me back up. Sometimes when people hear the good news of Jesus, it transforms their lives so much that they ask the same question of these people. Is this really the same person? Can someone who used to lie and cheat and steal and swear, could they have really become this truthful, wholesome, and wise human being? And the answer is yes. This can and does happen, right? And it's the same way after Jesus' resurrection. That the disciples they're faced with the same question. Who is this Jesus? Is this really Jesus? They say that in chapter 20. I didn't get there because we're trying to cut it down for time. But And the answer is yes. New creation does happen because Jesus got up out of the grave, transformed, alive again. Healing can happen in our lives. Our lives can be transformed. And the question is then the same one that they asked the man. The question for us is, how did it happen? How does it happen? And the answer throughout all of the Gospels, but especially in John, is it happens through Jesus. Our transformation happens through Jesus. And so where can we find him? The man didn't know the answer in the story, right? They asked, where is he? I don't know. But John's whole gospel is written so that we can find Jesus. And that's what's going on here in the story. So the Pharisees are afraid that something new is coming out of Judaism. And that they're not afraid in the same way that they're afraid of attack from the outside, right? They're used to that. They're used to being attacked from the outside. They hope that one day God will deal with those outside threats. But when people arise from within their own Jewish world, claiming to act in the name of the one true God, and start doing things that crack their system open from top to bottom, then they can't take it. Something new here is happening here in John chapter 9. If we look in Revelation, and even if we look here in John, starting in chapter 12, from the chapter 12 to the end of the book is only 1 week. Half of the book is 1 week of his life, Jesus' life. So this new creation starts with a week. And like we see in chapter 20, the resurrection is the start of a new week, a new day, a new moment. A new moment that the whole world has been longing for. The Sabbath, the rest that was Moses had commanded in the Torah. Moses talked about a rest at the end of the old creation, the end of the old week. There wasn't anything wrong with the creation, right? God said it was very good, Genesis 1, verse 31. But there wasn't anything wrong with the Sabbath command either. But as it stood, the Sabbath stood for the old way, which Israel and the world around them were still waiting for this new thing that God intended to do. The old way was good, but it was incomplete. Jesus had come to fulfill it by making all things new. And so when we are surrounded with fear and when we're surrounded by anger, put ourselves in this story. There's fear, there's anger, and the only way through it is to try and to see and reach out for Jesus and to follow him out of the darkness and into the light. Remember, this man was blind and now he's seeing. And now he's struggling against all these people. And his only option is to reach out for the truth that he knows is true. He's experienced it. Reach out and follow Jesus into the light. And so, as this war of words is heating up here, and it's getting heated, starting in verse 24. So a second time they summoned the man who had been blind and told him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." This war of words is getting heated up, and the question at the heart becomes very clear now. And that question is, where is God in all of these happenings? In John chapter 9, it's about healing. It's about blindness. It's about Moses. It's about Jesus. But most of all, this chapter is about God. Give God the glory, they say to this man who was born blind. Meaning, if you've been healed, it must have been God's doing alone and nothing to do with this Jesus. But John wants us to see that the man is giving God the glory exactly by sticking to his story and insisting that Jesus had healed him. God must have been working through Jesus. There's no other explanation that's possible. Like Clint said, it's the only logical explanation is that God is working through Jesus. He can't be a sinner. And so Jesus wants us to see that too, right? 4 times he's used that phrase of seeing. And that's what this passage is all about in chapter 9. It isn't just the man born blind who can now see, right? It's us, the readers, who are being led towards the light, which is Jesus himself. It's chapter 9, verse 5 here. And then I mentioned earlier about chapter 1 and verse 4 in John. So being a Christian can be confusing. We talked about this in the Bible class. People will often try to interpret your life and your lived experience for you. And they'll try and put you in this box or that box or this category or label you with this label. And that's specifically so they don't have to take you seriously, right? Because I know Catholics are in the bad box over here, and that's the don't trust box, and we'll put him in that box. And what we need to do is stick to what we know. I used to be blind, and now I can see. And that might be a very costly thing to say. But paying that cost, paying the social cost now, is much better than denying Jesus and what he's truly done for us. Because the outcome of that is hellfire and brimstone. So as we move towards the end of the chapter here, verses 35 through 41, we now see fully the blindness of the Pharisees. And one of the great pictures of the time that was really relied on for hope was a picture from Daniel about the Son of Man who's exalted to the seat right next to God. And he's specifically given the task of bringing God's judgment onto the world. We read it this morning in Daniel chapter 7. So when Jesus finds the man who's been healed and who's now been thrown out of the synagogue by this time and asks him whether he believes in the Son of Man, this is what he means. This is the image that he's trying to recall for him. Is this man, is he prepared to put his trust in the one who's come to bring God's judgment, God's dangerous but healing light? Will he trust that man? Who is the Son of Man? This formerly blind person asks. He's already claimed that Jesus was a prophet, and he has stuck to his story, right? That it was Jesus who opened his eyes. Twice he said that, verse 25 and verse 33. Now, he's invited to take a further step, to claim that Jesus is not only a prophet, not just a healer, but that he is the one that brings God's light. God's light that is burning with truth and holiness. And he brings that into the world. And so that's the same thing we need to believe this morning. Let me ask it in the form of a question. Do you believe that Jesus is the Holy One, that God's light, that by him God's light is coming into the world? That's the core of Christian belief. And that core Christian belief of believing that Jesus is the one who brings the light into the world will get us thrown out of the synagogue. What's the analog of the synagogue in our own life. So what if we're thrown out of the synagogue? So what if the authorities have declared us to be born in sinfulness? We have to follow where the truth leads, even if those who supposedly know the truth are suppressing it. We still have to follow the truth. Not only are they wrong, but they've constructed a whole system and inside of that system, they will never be wrong because it's their system that they made, right? They've turned away from the life-giving God and they've locked themselves into they've turned themselves away from the God and they locked themselves into a way of thinking that systematically excludes God and excludes the possibility of rescue because we're God's people. We've never been oppressed, right? And so it's Jesus himself who brings the light and the truth to expose that system to the world. He exposes the power of lies and of evil. Those things are very strong. Don't let somebody tell you that they're not strong. It's easy to be deceived. But it's only by checking back with Jesus, looking for him over and over again, that we can be sure that we are standing in the faith and that we are open to seeing God's light. So I want you to think about that this morning. Will you confess this morning that Jesus is the one through which God's light is coming into the world? If you're ready to make that confession, I'm willing to take it. If you're willing to make that confession, you're ready to repent, to give up your old way of life, to come back or to come to Jesus for the first time, to believe that he is the one who brings light into the world, to repent, to be baptized. We can help you with those things if you need them this morning. It's good to have everybody here this morning. We'll see you next week. John chapter 10.